The changes came slowly at first, like cracks spreading through ice. Kyle noticed them in small ways during the days that followed the reception. He would reach for his coffee mug and have it in his hand before he remembered deciding to pick it up. He would walk into a room full of alien delegates and know without being told that two of them were angry with each other and a third was lying about something. He started finishing people's sentences in his head, and he was right almost every time. He told himself it was nothing: stress, lack of sleep, the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar environment. But then the languages started. Kyle had spent months studying basic Torvani and a handful of Alori diplomatic phrases before his posting. Yet one morning, while passing through the station's commerce district, he overheard two Dranaki merchants arguing in their native tongue, a language built on guttural clicks and rolling growls that most non-Dranaki species could not even pronounce, let alone understand. Kyle understood every word. They were arguing about a weapons shipment that had been rerouted without authorization. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, his blood running cold. He had never studied a single word of Dranaki. That night, he sat in his quarters and pulled up a Dranaki tactical manual on his datapad, a document that was publicly available but written entirely in high dialect Dranaki script, a writing system so complex that certified translators spent years learning it. Kyle read the first page without effort, then the second, then the third. The words made sense the way his own language made sense, not through translation, but through direct understanding, as though the knowledge had always been there, waiting to be noticed. His hands were shaking when he put the datapad down. Meanwhile, the political situation on the station was getting worse. The Dranaki Collective and the Alori Empire had been locked in a territorial dispute over a resource-rich star system near the Galactic Rim. Negotiations had stalled. The Dranaki ambassador, a massive, scarred figure named Vorketh, had taken to making veiled threats during council sessions, reminding the other delegations that the Dranaki fleet was the largest in the sector. Kyle, still sitting in his back row seat during these sessions, began to see patterns. The Dranaki were not just posturing. Their supply convoys had shifted routes 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Communication frequencies used by Dranaki military channels had changed encryption protocols, something that typically happened only before major operations. And a cluster of Dranaki warships had been detected running engine tests near the contested border, far more ships than a simple patrol would require. Kyle compiled everything into a detailed report. He cross-referenced shipping data, communication logs, and fleet movement records that were available through the Concord's shared intelligence database. The conclusion was clear. The Dranaki were preparing for a military action, possibly against the station itself. He submitted the report to his superior, Liaison Director Gellin, a Torvani bureaucrat with 4 arms and a permanent expression of mild irritation. Gellin read the first paragraph, glanced at Kyle, and pushed the report aside. "Human pattern recognition," Gellin said, "is barely above random noise. I will not waste the Council's time with speculation from the newest and least experienced species in the Concord. Dismissed." Kyle stood in the doorway for a moment, jaw tight, and then left without another word. 2 days later, he encountered Vietha again. It happened in one of the station's reading halls, a quiet space lined with holographic archives from 100 civilizations. Kyle was sitting at a terminal, studying Dranaki fleet formations on his datapad, when a shadow fell across his desk. He looked up and found the Alori princess standing over him, her glowing eyes fixed on the screen. "Is that Dranaki high script?" she asked. "Yes," Kyle said. "You can read it?" "Apparently." Vietha studied him for a moment. Her expression was different from the reception. The open mockery was still there, but something else sat behind it now, something that looked almost like curiosity. "Playing soldier, little human," she said, but the words lacked their earlier bite. Kyle held her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not look down. Something had shifted in the way he carried himself, subtle but real, and Vietha noticed it. There was a steadiness in his eyes that had not been there before, a quiet weight that made her pause for half a second longer than she intended. She turned and walked away without another word. That night, the dreams came again. Kyle found himself standing in the golden chamber, the one with walls that went on forever, and light that moved like water. The humming voices were louder now, and he could almost make out words. They spoke of time, vast stretches of it. They spoke of seeds planted in young worlds. They spoke of a plan so large it spanned the lifetime of stars. He woke at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, with a ringing in his ears that did not fade for an hour. The bunk's metal frame was warped again, this time worse. The railing on the left side had been bent nearly 45 degrees inward, and there were impressions in the metal that matched the shape of human fingers. Kyle sat on the floor of his quarters, staring at his hands. They looked the same as always, ordinary hands, a farmer's grandson's hands, but something behind them, something deeper than muscle and bone, was growing. He went to the station's medical bay the next morning. The physician on duty was a Pelori, a soft-spoken species known for their medical expertise. She ran a full scan, frowning at her instruments, and then told Kyle that everything appeared normal for a human. "You are in good health. Perhaps the stress of your posting is affecting your sleep." Kyle nodded and thanked her and left. After he was gone, the Pelori physician turned back to her screen. One reading, buried deep in the neurological data, had flagged an anomaly, a pattern in Kyle's brain activity that did not match any known human baseline. She magnified it, studied it, and felt a chill run through her body. She had seen this pattern only once before, in a textbook about theoretical xenogenetics. It was a neural signature associated with a species that had not existed for over 100,000 years. The architects, the ancient ones, the beings who, according to legend, had seeded intelligent life across the galaxy and then disappeared without a trace. The physician stared at the reading for a long time. Then she told herself it was a sensor malfunction, deleted the file, and moved on to her next patient. She would regret that decision very soon. That evening, Kyle walked through one of the station's lower corridors, a maintenance passage that most personnel avoided. He was alone. The lights were dim. The hum of the station's power systems vibrated through the walls. He stopped, and without knowing why, pressed his hand flat against the corridor wall. The hum changed. It sharpened, focused, and then opened up inside his mind like a door swinging wide. He could feel the station, not just hear it, but feel it. Every system, every circuit, every pulse of energy flowing through kilometers of conduit and cable. The life support cycling air through 10,000 rooms, the defense grid holding its quiet watch, the communication arrays reaching out into deep space like invisible fingers. He felt all of it, and all of it felt him back. Kyle pulled his hand away, as though the wall had burned him. He stood there, breathing hard, his heart slamming against his ribs. Whatever was happening to him, it was not stress. It was not imagination. It was real, and it was growing, and it was bigger than anything he had ever been prepared for. He looked down at his hands one more time. They were trembling, but not with fear. The attack came at 0300 station time, when most of the corridors were quiet, and the diplomatic delegations were asleep in their quarters. Kyle was awake. He had not been able to sleep for 2 nights now. The energy inside him buzzed constantly, a low vibration in his bones that would not let him rest. He was sitting on the floor of his quarters, trying to meditate, trying to make sense of the noise inside his head, when the first explosion shook the station. The lights went red. Alarms screamed through every corridor. The station's communication system crackled, with overlapping emergency broadcasts in a dozen languages, all saying the same thing. Hostile fleet detected. Boarding parties inbound. All personnel to secure positions. The Drenaki had made their move. Kyle was on his feet and through his door in seconds. The corridor outside was chaos. Station personnel ran in every direction. Security officers shouted orders that nobody followed. Smoke poured from a ruptured conduit in the ceiling, and the floor shook as another explosion hit somewhere in the lower decks. Kyle's report had predicted exactly this. The rerouted supply shipments, the shifted communication frequencies, the fleet buildup near the border. Every piece of the puzzle had been right there in the data, and Liaison Director Gellen had thrown it in the trash because a human wrote it. There was no time for anger now. Kyle moved through the corridors on instinct, heading toward the diplomatic wing, where the high-value targets would be. The Drenaki were not here to destroy the station. They were here to take hostages, ambassadors, council members, and royals, leveraged to force the Concord into surrendering the disputed territory without a fight. He heard gunfire ahead, energy weapons, the sharp crack of Drenaki pulse rifles. He turned a corner and found a scene that stopped him cold. A group of about 15 people were trapped in a wide corridor junction. Most were civilian staff and low-ranking delegates who had been caught in the open when the attack began. Station security had set up a barricade, but it was thin. Just 3 guards with light sidearms against whatever was coming down the far hallway. And there, in the middle of the group, pressed against the wall, with her silver skin flickering with stress, was Princess Vietha. She had 3 members of her entourage with her, but her Aielori royal guards were gone, separated during the initial explosions. Vietha's hands were raised, and Kyle could see the air around her fingers shimmering as she tried to generate a psionic barrier. But something was wrong. The shimmer kept collapsing, flickering out like a candle in the wind. The Drenaki had deployed technology specifically designed to neutralize Aelori mental abilities. Vietha's most powerful gift had been taken from her in an instant. Kyle could see the fear on her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her afraid. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the far corridor. A Drenaki kill squad, 8 soldiers in full combat armor, rounded the corner and advanced in a tight formation. Their pulse rifles were up. Their eyes, cold and reptilian, scanned the group of trapped civilians with professional detachment. The lead soldier barked an order in Drenaki. Kyle understood it perfectly. Secure the Aelori Royal. Kill anyone who resists. The 3 station security guards opened fire. Their shots bounced off the Drenaki armor like rain off stone. The Drenaki returned fire without hesitation, and 2 of the guards went down instantly. The 3rd dove behind the barricade, clutching a wound in his shoulder. Vietha tried again to raise her barrier. It flickered for half a second and died. She looked around the corridor with wide, desperate eyes, searching for any way out. Her gaze landed on Kyle. He saw it in her expression, the calculation, the dismissal. What could a human do? Humans had no powers, no armor, no weapons. He was the weakest thing in this corridor. Kyle stepped forward. He did not fully understand what happened next. Later, when he tried to describe it, the best he could manage was that something inside him opened, like a door he had not known existed. One moment he was Kyle Beckett, a liaison officer from Ohio with no combat training and no special abilities. The next moment, he was something else. His eyes changed first. A pale golden light filled them, bright enough to cast shadows on the corridor walls. The air around him began to vibrate, a deep hum that resonated in the chest of every person nearby. The floor beneath his feet groaned, and the metal panels rippled as though the station itself was responding to his presence. The Dranaki squad leader saw him and fired. The energy bolt crossed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. Kyle raised one hand, and the bolt stopped. It hung in the air in front of his palm, spinning slowly, a frozen needle of blue-white light. A second bolt followed, then a third. They all stopped. They floated in a line before him, like stars caught in amber. Kyle closed his fist. The bolts dissolved into harmless sparks that drifted to the floor like snow. The corridor went silent. Kyle moved. He did not run. He walked forward with steady, measured steps, and the golden light around him grew brighter with each one. The Dranaki soldiers fired everything they had: pulse rounds, concussion grenades, even a plasma charge that should have vaporized anything organic within 10 meters. Kyle caught them all, redirected them, dissolved them. The air in front of him became a wall of golden energy that nothing could penetrate. He reached the first soldier and placed his hand on the barrel of the soldier's rifle. The metal bent like soft clay. Kyle pulled the weapon away, tossed it aside, and pushed the soldier against the wall with a force that was precise and measured. Enough to knock him out, not enough to kill him. He moved through the rest of the squad the same way. He disarmed them one by one. He bent their weapons into useless shapes. He sealed the corridor behind them by pressing his hands against the blast doors and willing them shut. The metal obeyed him as though it were alive. In 45 seconds, 8 Dranaki soldiers lay unconscious on the floor, and not one of them was dead. Kyle stood in the center of the corridor, breathing hard. Golden light flickered across his skin like embers. His hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer force of what was flowing through him. He turned and looked back at the group of trapped civilians. They stared at him in complete silence. The station security guard behind the barricade had his mouth open. The civilian staff looked like they had just watched the laws of physics get rewritten in front of them. Viatha stood against the wall, her luminous eyes wide, her hand still raised in the position of her failed psionic barrier. She stared at Kyle as though she had never seen him before. "What are you?" she whispered. Kyle looked down at his own hands. The golden light was still there, pulsing faintly, like a second heartbeat. "I have no idea," he said. There was no time to process it. More Dranaki squads were moving through the station. Kyle could feel them, like dark spots on a map that existed only in his mind. He could feel the station systems struggling, the defense grid overwhelmed, the communication arrays jammed by Dranaki signal scramblers. He could also feel how to fix it. Kyle pressed his hand against the nearest wall panel and pushed his awareness into the station's network. He found the jammed communication arrays and burned through the Dranaki scramblers with a pulse of energy that came from somewhere inside him. He found the defense grid and rerouted power from non-essential systems to reinforce the shields around the diplomatic wing. He found the scattered security teams and opened channels to coordinate them. Then he moved. He went through the station like a storm, calm at its center and devastating at its edges. Every Dranaki squad he encountered was neutralized with the same precise, non-lethal force. He sealed breached corridors. He repaired damaged systems by touch. He guided trapped personnel to safety through routes he should not have known, but could see clearly in his mind. The station's entire layout spread before him like a living blueprint. The Dranaki commander, watching from the flagship outside the station, received increasingly frantic reports from his boarding teams. One by one, they went silent. The commander demanded to know what weapon the humans had deployed. No one could answer him. By the time the Concord reinforcement fleet arrived, 2 hours later, and the Dranaki warships withdrew, the boarding assault had been completely defeated. Every Dranaki soldier on the station had been neutralized. Every hostage had been rescued. Not a single civilian had been killed. And at the center of it all, Collapsed in a corridor on the station's lower deck was Kyle Beckett. The golden light had faded from his skin. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious, and he looked like what he had always appeared to be, an ordinary human, unremarkable and small. But the entire station now knew that he was anything but. Kyle woke in a room he did not recognize. It was large, brightly lit, and filled with equipment he had never seen before. Holographic displays floated above him, casting shifting patterns of blue and green light across the ceiling. He was lying on a medical platform that hummed faintly beneath his back, and there were sensor bands wrapped around his wrists, his temples, and his chest. He tried to sit up. A firm hand pressed his shoulder back down. "Easy," said a voice. "You've been unconscious for 14 hours. Kyle blinked and focused on the face above him. It belonged to a Pelori physician, the same one who had scanned him days earlier and found nothing unusual. She did not look calm anymore. She looked like someone who had seen something that had broken every assumption she had ever held about the universe. "Where am I?" Kyle asked. "High security medical suite," she said. "Level 1 clearance. You have a lot of people waiting to talk to you." She was not exaggerating. When Kyle was finally allowed to sit up and look around the room, he saw representatives from nearly every major species on the station. Alori senior psionics stood in a cluster by the far wall, their glowing eyes fixed on him with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Torvani scientists operated scanning equipment that hummed and clicked as it processed data. Pelori medical staff moved between terminals, exchanging quiet, urgent words. 2 Dranaki observers stood near the door, arms folded, their expressions unreadable. And in the center of the room, displayed on a massive holographic screen, was a complete map of Kyle's genetic code. Most of it looked normal, human, ordinary. But there, woven through the strands, like golden thread through plain cloth, were sequences that did not belong. They were complex beyond anything human science had ever produced, and they pulsed with a faint energy that the Torvani scanners could detect but could not explain. The head Torvani scientist, a thin figure with 4 arms and large dark eyes, stepped forward and addressed the room. "The results are conclusive," he said. His voice was steady, but Kyle could see the tension in the way he held his lower arms against his body. "The anomalous genetic markers found in this human's DNA are a 97% match to the theoretical genetic signature of the architects." The room went very still. The architects. Kyle had heard the name in passing during his training, the way someone might hear about ancient myths. They were the oldest known civilization in galactic history, a species of immense power and intelligence that had existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. According to legend, the architects had seeded intelligent life across the galaxy, nurturing young species on countless worlds before vanishing without explanation. No one knew where they went. No one knew why they left. They had become a story, a mystery, a ghost. And now, apparently, they were inside Kyle Beckett's DNA. The implication, the Torvani scientist continued, choosing his words with great care, is that the architects did not simply vanish. They embedded fragments of their genetic legacy into younger species. Dormant code, designed to remain hidden for millennia, waiting for the right conditions to activate. He paused. Humanity appears to be one of those species, perhaps the primary one. Silence held the room like a fist. An Alori senior psionic spoke next, her voice thin and ancient. "We have searched for traces of the architects for 100,000 years. We found nothing. And, all this time, their legacy was sleeping inside the youngest species in the Concord. Inside the weakest species," one of the Dranaki observers corrected, his tone flat. "Inside the most overlooked species," the Pelori physician said quietly, "which may have been exactly the point. Kyle sat on the medical platform and listened to all of this with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. 20 days ago, he had been carrying documents and sitting in back rows. Now he was being told that an ancient civilization had hidden the most powerful genetic legacy in the galaxy inside his people, the species that everyone else considered a joke. The political fallout was immediate and brutal. Within hours of the announcement, every delegation on the station had called emergency sessions. The Dranaki demanded that Kyle be handed over for thorough examination, which everyone understood meant something far less polite. The Torvani called for a scientific quarantine. Several smaller species petitioned for humanity to be expelled from the Concord entirely, arguing that an uncontrolled architect awakening could destabilize the entire galactic order. The Aelori were split. Their elder counselors argued that humanity must be monitored and controlled, the architect legacy guided by wiser hands. Their younger members, including Vietha, pushed back, but they were outnumbered by centuries of institutional caution. Kyle was moved to secured quarters and told to wait. He was not a prisoner, they assured him. He was being protected. The distinction felt thin. For 3 days, he sat in that room while the galaxy argued about what to do with him. He received no visitors. His communication access was restricted. He spent his time staring at his hands, flexing his fingers, trying to feel the golden energy that had poured through him during the Dranaki attack. It was still there, but quieter now, a low hum beneath his skin, like an engine idling. On the 4th day, the door opened, and Vietha walked in. She was alone. No entourage, no attendants. She wore a simple silver robe instead of her usual elaborate diplomatic dress, and her luminous skin was dimmer than he remembered, as though the stress of the past few days had drained some of her light. She sat down across from him and said nothing for a long time. Kyle waited. "I owe you my life," she said finally. Her voice was stripped of its usual sharpness, its performance quality. She sounded like a person talking to another person, nothing more. "On that corridor, when the Dranaki came, you saved me, you saved all of us." "I know," Kyle said. "And I owe you an apology." She met his eyes. "I treated you as beneath me because that is what I was taught. My entire civilization views younger species as children at best, as lesser beings at worst. I believed it without questioning it. I was wrong." Kyle studied her face. The arrogance was gone, or at least hidden deep enough that he could not see it. What remained was something more honest, a woman confronting the fact that everything she had believed about the order of the universe had just been turned upside down. "You weren't the only one," Kyle said. "The whole galaxy looked at us and saw nothing. Every species on this station treated humans like we were a mistake that somehow got invited to the party." He paused. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the architects hid their legacy in the species nobody would ever think to look at. Vietha considered this for a moment. "That is either the most brilliant strategy in the history of the universe," she said, "or the most insane." Kyle almost smiled. "Sounds pretty human to me." Something shifted in Vietha's expression, a crack in the wall she had built between herself and the rest of the galaxy. She did not smile back, but her eyes softened in a way Kyle had not seen before. "What happens now?" she asked. Before Kyle could answer, his datapad chimed with an incoming transmission. He looked at the screen and felt his stomach drop. It was from Earth. A coded military channel, Priority 1. The message was brief and staggering. In the past 72 hours, over 400 humans across the planet had begun exhibiting anomalous abilities. A construction worker in Denver had lifted a steel beam with his bare hands. A teenager in Atlanta had accidentally shorted out every electronic device within a 50-meter radius. A retired teacher in Portland had started speaking languages she had never learned, 6 of them, including two that linguists could not identify. The awakenings were accelerating. Whatever had happened to Kyle was not unique to him. It was spreading. Kyle put the datapad down and looked at Vietha. "What happens now," he said quietly, "is that everything changes." Humanity was not just waking up, it was rising. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Concord had not been this full in over 200 years. Every species in the Alliance had sent their highest-ranking representatives. The Aelori occupied the elevated seats on the north wall, their silver skin glowing beneath the chamber's pale lights. The Drenaki filled the eastern block, their massive armored bodies packed together like a wall of stone and scale. The Torvani sat in precise rows to the west, their four-armed forms perfectly still. Pelori, Vashin, Orelon, and a dozen other species filled every remaining seat. The observation galleries above were standing room only. At the center of the hall, a single podium waited, empty. The question before the council was simple in its words and enormous in its implications. What to do about humanity? Ambassador Vorketh of the Drenaki spoke first. He rose from his seat, like a mountain deciding to move, his scarred face hard and his voice harder. "The facts are plain," he said. "The humans carry a genetic weapon left behind by the architects, a species so powerful that even the memory of them frightens us. This weapon is now activating uncontrollably across their homeworld. Hundreds of humans are manifesting abilities that rival or exceed our own, and the number is growing every day." He swept his gaze across the chamber. "If we do not act now, if we do not contain this threat while it is still small, we will be facing a force that no fleet and no alliance can stop. I propose immediate quarantine of the human homeworld and suppression of the architect gene in all human subjects." A murmur ran through the chamber. Several delegations nodded. The fear was real and visible, sitting in the room like a living thing. The Torvani delegation head spoke next, more measured, but no less concerned. "We do not advocate suppression," he said carefully, "but we must acknowledge the risk. The architects possess the ability to reshape stars, to fold space, to engineer life itself. If that power is truly waking inside humanity, the galaxy must have safeguards. We propose a joint scientific oversight committee with authority to monitor and, if necessary, limit the awakening process." More nods, more quiet agreement. Kyle watched all of this from a waiting area behind the main chamber, listening through a live feed on a wall-mounted screen. He stood with his arms at his sides, dressed in the same plain uniform he had worn since his first day on the station. No medals, no ceremonial robes. He looked exactly like what he was, a man from a small town who had ended up impossibly far from home. The door behind him opened, and Vietha stepped in. "They're going to call you soon," she said. Kyle nodded. "Are you ready?" He looked at her and almost laughed. A short, quiet sound with no humor in it. "I was an errand runner 3 weeks ago. I don't think ready is the right word." Vietha moved to stand beside him, watching the screen. On it, another delegate was speaking, urging caution, using polite language to dress up what was essentially a vote to put humanity in a cage. "I am going to speak before the council when the time comes," Vietha said. "I intend to argue on your behalf." Kyle looked at her. "Why?" "Because I was on that corridor when the Drenaki came," she said. "I saw what you did. Not just the power. Anyone can have power. I saw what you chose to do with it. You could have killed every one of those soldiers. Your abilities were more than sufficient. But you didn't. You disarmed them, you restrained them, and you let them live." She turned to face him. "That choice is worth more than any genetic legacy. If your species exercises that same restraint as more of you awaken, then the galaxy has nothing to fear from humanity, and everything to gain." Kyle held her gaze for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "I am one voice. The council has hundreds." The summons came 10 minutes later. Kyle walked through the chamber doors and into the largest room he had ever entered in his life. The hall opened up around him like the inside of a cathedral, rising hundreds of feet to a domed ceiling that displayed a live view of the stars outside. Every face in the room turned toward him. Thousands of eyes, some glowing, some dark, some cold, some curious, all watching. Kyle walked to the podium at the center of the hall. This was the same chamber where, just weeks ago, he had sat in the last row, invisible and ignored, taking notes that nobody read. Now there was not a single being in the room who did not know his name. He gripped the edges of the podium, took a breath, and spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not make grand gestures. He spoke plainly, the way a man might speak to his neighbors across a fence, because that was the only way he knew how to talk. "My name is Kyle Beckett," he said. "I'm from a place called Ohio, on a planet called Earth. 3 weeks ago, I was a liaison officer that nobody in this station took seriously. Most of you didn't know I existed. The ones who did, wished I didn't." A few delegates shifted in their seats. Vietha, in the Elori section, kept her eyes fixed on him. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that humans are special," Kyle continued. "We're fragile. We break easily. We get sick. We die young. By the standards of almost every species in this room, we're barely more than children stumbling around in the dark." He paused. "But that has never stopped us." The chamber was silent. Humans have always been underestimated. We have always been told that we're too small, too weak, too short-lived to matter. And maybe that's true by your measurements. But here's the thing about humans. We don't accept the measurements. We don't look at a mountain and say it's too tall. We climb it. We don't look at an ocean and say it's too wide. We build a boat. We have been clawing our way forward since the first day we stood upright on our little planet, and we have never, not once, stopped reaching for things we had no business reaching for. He let that sit for a moment. The architects, whoever they were, didn't hide their legacy inside my species because we were strong. They hid it inside us because we never stopped trying. Even when every logical calculation says we should give up, we don't. That's stubbornness. That refusal to accept our own limits, that is what makes us human. And if the architects saw value in that, then maybe the rest of this galaxy should take another look. He straightened up and looked directly at Ambassador Vorketh, whose massive arms were crossed over his chest. "I know you're afraid," Kyle said. "I understand it. Power like this is terrifying, especially when it shows up in a species you've spent years dismissing. But I am not a weapon. My people are not weapons. We are what we have always been, ordinary beings doing extraordinary things because we don't know how to do anything else." He turned his gaze to the full assembly. "I'm offering a partnership, not submission, not dominance, cooperation. Humanity will share everything we learn about the architect legacy, openly, with every species, without restriction. In return, we ask for what we've always asked for, a seat at the table and a chance to prove ourselves." He stepped back from the podium. "You called us the universe's afterthought." His eyes found Vietha in the Elori delegation. She held his gaze without flinching. "Maybe we were, but afterthoughts have a way of becoming the main story." He went silent, and the chamber remained quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then Vietha stood. It was a deliberate motion, visible to every delegate in the hall. She rose from her seat in the Elori section and placed her hand over her heart in the Elori gesture of formal support. She said nothing. She didn't need to. A beat of silence. Then the Pelori delegation head stood as well. Then the Orellan ambassador. Then the Vashin representatives, all three of them, rising together. One by one, delegation after delegation, rose to their feet. The smaller species first, then the mid-level powers, then the major civilizations. The Torvani delegation head hesitated, looked at his colleagues, and then stood. The sound of seats shifting and bodies rising filled the chamber like a slow wave. Ambassador Vorkath remained seated. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. His cold reptilian eyes burned with something between anger and fear. But he looked around the chamber, counted the numbers, and understood. He was outvoted. The resolution passed. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Concord, not as observers, not as curiosities, not as subjects of study or containment, but as equals. The chamber erupted in sound. Dozens of languages overlapped in a wave of voices, some celebratory, some anxious, all aware that the galaxy had just changed in a way that could never be undone. Kyle stepped away from the podium and walked through the crowd. Delegates from species he had never spoken to reached out to touch his shoulder, to nod at him, to acknowledge him in ways large and small. He accepted each gesture with a quiet nod of his own, but he did not stop walking until he reached the observation window at the far end of the hall. He stood there, looking out at the stars, billions of them, scattered across the blackness like grains of sand on an infinite shore. Somewhere out there, impossibly far away and impossibly close to his heart, was a small blue planet where more of his kind were waking up. Ordinary people discovering extraordinary things inside themselves. Farmers and teachers and teenagers and retirees, all of them carrying a legacy they had never known about, planted in their blood by beings who had believed in them before they even existed. Footsteps behind him. He did not need to turn around to know who it was. Vitha came to stand beside him at the window. Not behind him, not above him, beside him. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the stars. For what it's worth, Vietha said at last, I think the architects chose well. Kyle looked out at the endless glittering dark. He thought about Ohio. He thought about his grandfather's farm, and the state university, and the training program, and the back row of the council chamber, and the corridor where everything changed. He thought about a princess who had called him an afterthought, and was now standing next to him as an equal. We'll see, he said. The same words he had whispered alone in his quarters on the night everything began. But this time, standing in the light of a billion stars, with the weight of an ancient legacy settling onto his shoulders, and the future of his species stretching out before him like an open road, he was smiling. The universe's afterthought had just become its main story. And this was only the beginning. Kyle Beckett had never felt smaller in his entire life than the day he stepped onto the Galactic Concord station. The place was enormous. It stretched out in every direction, like a floating city made of glass and metal, hanging in the black emptiness of space. Thousands of alien species walked its corridors, spoke in languages he could barely recognize, and carried themselves with the kind of confidence that only came from belonging to civilizations millions of years old. Kyle did not belong here. At least, that was what everyone seemed to think. He was a human. That word carried weight out here in the galaxy, and none of it was good. Humanity had only been admitted to the Galactic Concord 3 years ago, and they were treated the way a stray dog might be treated at a royal banquet. Tolerated. Barely. Humans were considered primitive. They had no telepathy, no natural energy abilities, no bioluminescent skin or armored exoskeletons. They lived for 80 years if they were lucky, which most alien species found almost tragically funny. Kyle's job title was Diplomatic Liaison Officer, but that was a generous description. In practice, he was an errand runner. He carried documents between offices. He sat in the back row during council sessions and took notes that nobody ever read. He was spoken about as though he were furniture. The alien delegates would glance at him and then look away, the way someone might look at a fly buzzing near the window. He had earned this post through test scores and sheer determination. He had grown up on a small farm outside of Columbus, Ohio, worked his way through a state university, and then spent 2 years in a government training program designed to prepare humans for off-world assignments. He had beaten out hundreds of other candidates, but none of that mattered here. Here, he was just the human. It was during the 3rd week of his posting that Princess Vietha of the Aelori Empire arrived on the station. The Aelori were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy. They stood nearly 7 feet tall, with smooth, luminous skin that shifted between shades of silver and pale violet. Their eyes glowed faintly, and they possessed powerful psionic abilities that allowed them to move objects with thought, read surface emotions, and create barriers of pure mental energy. They were beautiful in a way that made other species feel clumsy and dull just by standing near them. Vietha was the youngest member of the Aelori royal family. She was sharp, proud, and utterly bored by the Concord. She had been sent here as a political gesture, and she made no effort to hide her displeasure. She walked through the station like she owned it, her entourage of 4 Aelori attendants trailing behind her, and she looked at the other species with a mixture of mild curiosity and open disdain. Kyle first saw her across the main reception hall during a welcome event for new delegates. She was surrounded by admirers from several alien species, all competing for her attention. He watched from his usual spot near the back wall, holding a drink he hadn't touched, and thought she looked like someone who had never been told no in her entire life. He did not expect her to notice him. He was wrong. Vietha broke away from the crowd midway through the evening and walked directly toward him. Her entourage followed like a silver tide. Kyle straightened up, unsure what was happening. She stopped in front of him and tilted her head, studying him the way someone might study an insect pinned under glass. "You are the human," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Kyle said. "Kyle Beckett, diplomatic liaison." "Liaison," she repeated, and the word sounded almost funny in her mouth. "Tell me, Kyle Beckett, is it true that your species still uses combustion engines on your homeworld?" "Some of us do, yes." "And you have no psionic capability at all? None?" "None. And your natural lifespan is what? 70 years? 80? About that on average." Vietha looked at her attendants, and a thin smile crossed her face. "Remarkable," she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "And yet they let you sit in diplomatic councils. How generous of the Concord." One of her attendants laughed softly. Kyle felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his face still. Vietha leaned closer, just slightly, and lowered her voice so that it carried perfectly to the nearby delegates who were pretending not to listen. "It must be humbling," she said, "being the universe's afterthought." The laughter spread. A Drenaki trade official nearby showed his teeth in amusement. A pair of Torvani scholars exchanged knowing looks. Even a few delegates who had always been polite to Kyle turned away to hide their smiles. Kyle looked at Vietha. Her glowing eyes were steady and confident. She expected him to stammer, or flush, or try to defend his species with some clumsy argument she could bat away for sport. He did none of those things. He simply nodded, once, and said, "Enjoy the reception, Princess." Then he turned and walked away. He heard more laughter behind him, but he did not look back. He walked through the corridors of the station with measured steps, past the glowing alien architecture and the crowds of species who had built empires while humanity was still learning to make fire. He walked until he reached his quarters, a small room barely larger than a closet, tucked into the section of the station reserved for low-priority personnel. He sat on the edge of his bunk and pressed his hands together. His jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled, but his pulse hammered in his temples. He pulled up the holographic display on his desk terminal. A map of the galaxy appeared, vast and glittering, and there, almost invisible among the billions of stars, was a tiny blue dot, Earth, His home. The place that every species in this station considered a backwater. Kyle stared at it for a long time. "We'll see," he whispered. He shut off the display and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling in the dark. He did not know that deep inside his mind, buried beneath layers of ordinary human neurology, something had hurt him. Something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. And for the first time in millennia, it stirred. It started as a faint warmth at the base of his skull, so slight he mistook it for the beginnings of a headache. He pressed his fingers to the back of his neck, frowned, and then let it go. Within minutes, he was asleep. But in his dreams, he stood in a place he had never seen before. A vast chamber made of golden light, with walls that stretched beyond sight, and a sound like 1,000 voices humming in perfect harmony. He could not understand the words, but he felt their meaning settle into his bones like a promise. "You are ready." Kyle woke with a gasp just before dawn. Everything was normal, except that the metal railing on the side of his bunk was bent slightly inward, as though something had gripped it with terrible force during the night. He stared at it, touched it with his fingertips, and felt his heart begin to race. Something was different. Something had changed. He just didn't know what yet.